The sitting is resumed. Senator Kevin Boyce, that is.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do apologize for my absence earlier, as I was in the other place where we have not settled the priority as to how we exist in both. Good afternoon, colleagues. I rise on behalf of the independent side of the proverbial table, and I must state from the onset that this is a topic which I do have some conflict in, as my firm represents a major electric supplier. However, I have been guided in the past that when making contributions of this nature, that I declare that conflict and try as much as possible to stay out of certain affrays. Now, sir, what we start with is, as usual, with my presentation. And I will say, however, that while I have declared that conflict, you will note, and I'm giving everyone early warning, that this speech may end on a somewhat selfish note. So I'm giving everyone ample opportunity to be able to rise as necessary. Sir, the proposed bill which speaks to the Utilities Regulation Act 282, and I was able to listen in part to the many and sensible contributions made all around this morning. And the proposed wording as set out has garnered some concern, where persons speak to the concern about the minister, the proposed insertion. The minister may, on the recommendation of the commission. Now, the recommendation of the commission part doesn't seem to have garnered much attention on social media. Everyone is focusing on the minister, what the minister may do. On his own initiative, exempt the supply of electricity from a renewable energy resource by a renewable energy producer from the application of all or any of the provisions of this act, where the minister is satisfied in all the circumstances that the exemption is required in the public interest. I listened to my colleague, Senator Nichols, as he set out the checks and balances that the courts provide. I listened to my colleague, Senator King, as he set out the checks and balances that good old Bajan raising provides. But we have to be cognizant that, yes, the wording is wide, but we have heard from the leader of the government business as to why the wording is the way it is and the intention of the government. But let's come back to that shortly. Now, the Utility Regulation Act, Mr. President, you may likely recall that we dealt with this in 2020 when dealing with the amendment which was done on the 7th, it commenced on the 17th of July 2020. And by that amendment, the government exercises right with regard to its energy policy to bring renewable energy producers and renewable energy resources under the governance of the Utilities Regulation Act. Similarly, in 2020, the government exercised its power and extended the function of the FTC by way of the Fair Trading Commission Act 2020 to include renewable energy producers. Now, what this bill does is in 2023 is to give the power of the minister, who we know has to act within the ambit of government policy, the ability to make certain exemptions to the application of the Utility Regulations Act to certain renewable energy producers. At the end of the day, sir, there is little, if any, restriction on government and its policy. The government has set out why it is doing what it's doing, and guess what? Active citizenry means that persons can make comments and can agitate and can say whether they like or dislike what the government proposes. Within the pillars of Parliament, government is entitled to set out its legislative reasoning for why it's done what it is proposing or what it is going to do, with, of course, certain restrictions. At the end of the day, only in few matters such as constitutional issues, or dare I say public sentiment, does the government find itself in a situation where it is limited as to how it can maneuver. And what is the government policy? Sir, I recall in the last time we debated this, and I had given a similar qualification and conflict warning, and I was almost gently chastised by Senator Harewood with regard to the government policy and the Barbados National Energy Plan for 2030, and the fact is better that we try to do it, and if we fail, well, at least we try, but let's push forward with our goals. I recall that conversation well. The blows were not too heavy. On previous debates, issues were raised, of course, with the cost of getting to a carbon neutral state. You will recall, sir, Senator Malalu used the opportunity to speak about the infrastructure and the cost of having the electronic vehicles and the necessary charging at port station and the actual proof of the proverbial pudding with regard to the cost implementation. Now, of course, no doubt buoyed by the COP28 objective, which is to triple the renewable energy generation of the world to 11,000 gigawatts by 2030, the government is saying that this legislation is necessary for them to achieve that goal. That's what this is. Now, while the government certainly is entitled to do so, we have to, of course, be aware that persons will be concerned of the wide powers that are set out within the legislation. I was joking to a colleague of mine that it may also even behoove the government to appoint a minister of WhatsApp so as to allow messages which the government think necessary to get out there. Because at the end of the day, when persons see legislation which is wide and allows for those who may seek to criticize or condemn because of the potential utilization of that legislation for a nefarious purpose, the only way to counter such assertions is by informed and distributed information in a method that is accessible, repeated, and easily digested. The Prime Minister has said that politics is the art of repetition. I heard her well. And while I have certainly no interest in elective politics, while I play my part and contribute in this scenario, it would seem that this is one of those cases where the government may need to get its message out short, simple, consistent, via WhatsApp would be my humble recommendation, sir. Now, as someone who has had a recent interaction with the FTC, I can say that the organization itself does exemplary service, and has been given a rather heavy mandate with the amount of issues that they have to deal with. Again, the question of resources, which I repeat. Again, the question of how do we get the right persons into those roles. Again, how do you keep the balance of regulation with government policy? That is something which the government has to grapple with. Now, while we have checks and balances offered by the courts, we have seen recently that when persons avail themselves to that protection and legislative mechanism, they are also criticized. They are also criticized when they utilize the mechanism providing the same legislation. But that's another topic, sir. I believe, sir, that continued education of the public as to the rights and roles of the various parties and stakeholders would redound to the nation's benefit. I think we should give credit. We are now, I think, fully, watch me now, electrified on the issue of renewable energy. Barbadians are now in the do with renewable energy more than any time before. We knew we had it with the hot water. I think we are now fully engaged with regard to the concept of electrical production. I personally have some views which I will tread carefully on, that it might be too late. It might be too late today for persons who wish to benefit as others have with regard to the renewable energy push. But that is life. Persons who have access to information and access to capital are sometimes able to take advantage of the lay of the land. Now, if I may, these are the recommendations which I will consider, or which I propose to assist the government, ever so humbly, the independent collaborative contribution that we produce, sir, with the exercise that we find ourselves. Sir, organizations like BREA, I think, ought to be commended for their continued assistance to the public in terms of understanding the issue with renewable energy. I myself have had to go on their website, and I found it very informative and very interesting. The government does have the information portals for renewable energy, but there's a lot of information, and again, making it digestible and easy to access may redound to the benefit of us all. The tax benefits to do with renewable energy, in my mind, are somewhat unclear, but I believe that they are set out to be $10,000 per annum up to a period of 5 years, but I don't think it is as clear as it could be to persons as to how it is utilized upon implementation for a household that is not renting. Sir, the ease of doing business for a renewable energy project, there is no ease of doing business for a renewable energy project, because you have to be able to coordinate with the persons who is doing install, the persons who are providing the electricity from the organization that does it, the persons from the government department who has to sign off on certain aspects of it, and the different licenses that you need. It is not a simple exercise at any attempt to bring together a third-party mechanism that captures all that will definitely assist. And then, of course, we all know the joy of coordinating with the government departments and the need for more resources and ease of access. At the end of the day, sir, this is a piece of legislation which ties in to the government's policy. And what I find somewhat interesting is that when the legislation was done in 2020, which brought the renewable energy under the ambit of the FTC, there was little public sentiment. But as life goes on and things change, persons perhaps become more educated. And I said, Mr. President, that I would end my contribution on a selfish note. And this is it. Sir, today is the birthday of a gentleman by the name of John Boyce, who has championed renewable energy since 1996. In terms of offering back then, it wasn't sexy, but the way of renewable energy was to reduce the cost of buildings by reducing their consumption. So, we think about renewable energy as not necessarily producing energy, but it's also being conservative with regard to your utilization. And I wanted to take this public forum to thank him for all that he's done for me and to wish him a happy birthday. I thank you, Mr. President.
And I must join with you in wishing him a happy birthday. We both served in this place, in the Honourable Senate, 1994 to 1999. We have many fond memories of our exchanges here, and I certainly wish him the best. And he was always high in my estimation, but he's higher because he shares the birthday with my son. But my son shares with him, he's younger. Today is my son's birthday as well. So, Yes, great minds. Thank you very much. So wish former Senator Boyce happy birthday for me. Speakers, Senator Hibbert.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise in full support of the amendment before us, and I am moved by the previous contribution in terms of the global perspective brought by Senator Boyce in terms of why this amendment is going to put Barbados in full stead and preparation for the change in the environment, notwithstanding the fact that the particular targets, as you alluded to, sir, in terms of COP, are being challenged even more now than before, and there's going to be a significant demand for different energy components such as storage. We do expect that the prices are going to rise. We do expect that the competition for those components are going to rise, and we need to put the government in a full range of flexibility by way of this amendment to ensure that we can move swiftly to grab hold of those particular components. So in this case, it could be storage, it could be something else tomorrow. I do also take the fact that based on the expressions I've read online, I do not get the impression that there is any significant level of confusion, sir, with regard to what we are approaching today. In fact, the greatest level of confusion I would have had today, and it was a welcome confusion because it really shows the independent perspective, is where one senator mentioned the environment as being chaotic, and the previous speaker before that senator mentioned senator mentioned the environment as being one of fit for purpose for procurement, and that caused me to be a bit confused. But I was moved by the gesture of understanding the independent perspectives, sir. Despite what may have been put in the public domain, this bill adds value to the operations of the Fair Trading Commission, sir. Before Senator Cummins was appointed to the post of Minister of Energy, we had a Fair Trading Commission that couldn't even, at that point, have access to something called Plexus, which is a system that is used by the utility to allow them to do modeling of the energy sector. And if they can't have access to some of those tools and other contributions from consultancies that they needed, it means that when it comes to doing heavy lifting like this particular need, that they will be in a worse position to say, you know what, this is the process that we need to go about to get the best value for money for Barbados in terms of energy storage. And this is a very unique competitive procurement process we're talking about. This is not the process 2 years ago when this institution, sir, when this institution went about getting a generator, which is on the western wing. We understand the circumstances leading to it, but it's not the same process of getting quotations, person just sending in and blam, putting the generator. There's a situation where this procurement is being led by the government in the interest of the public, but it has to merge with the operations of a utility to which the government, unfortunately, does not have sufficient shareholdings in anymore. But it is a private-public partnership to some extent when we think about that. It's not a straightforward procurement, sir. Sir, you may get the impression that there was a bit of discomfort caused by replacing the term effectively competitive with public interest. But you can be effectively competitive and still serve the public interest. But you see, the danger of trying to overshadow public interest with effective competition is that it does not necessarily mean the best value of money for the public. It may be the lowest price. It may be the strongest piece of equipment. In this case, if you're talking about batteries, but it may not serve the public of Barbados the best, sir. And that is a dangerous thing that we must highlight. Cheaper energy versus sustainable energy. And while it may seem cheaper and persons may place emphasis on the pockets and how much money you can save by putting in a solar panel, really and truthfully, we have an environment to consider as well. We have an environment to consider as well. And I'm talking about the natural environment. There are a couple of questions that were asked earlier, sir. I cannot answer all of them at this particular stage. I think some of the answers will be rather premature, but some of them I believe I would like to touch on. I believe that the question that was asked in terms of the design of the energy sector earlier and what it's going to look like was answered by the same person that asked the question, because the statement that followed the question was that there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of competing interests there, so I would not delve into answering the question which was asked by the person that asked it. The other question that was asked, sir, highlighted SDG 7 and focused heavily on the statement in terms of SDG 7, 7.1 in particular, which ensures universal access to affordable energy. That statement was not fully correct in terms of what SDG 7.1 says, and I would like to, sir, for the benefit of the chamber, read out exactly what it says. It says SDG 7.1 focuses on ensuring universal access to affordable, that is one word, reliable, and modern energy services. And when we put emphasis on reliable, we get to recognize that it's not about only money, but it's about the sustainability of the energy resources that we're looking at as well, sir. Then there was another question in terms of the ownership of the battery, a very, very, very relevant question, sir. Very relevant question. While I am not in a position to answer the particular ownership, correct, I would lean on the fact that we have stakeholders involved or implied to be involved, such as the IDB. And in the usual pretext of the IDB when it comes to matters of this nature in terms of competitive bidding frameworks, from what I've observed, there is a leaning towards sustainability and the involvement of the private sector for the most part, sir. Not necessarily always getting involved with government for the end product to be owned by government, but the private sector to be involved. That is not a statement clarifying exactly who will own, but I tend to recognize that the IDB favors sustainable interventions as well. I do support the call for regular updates from the public in different forms as well. No issue with that. I do recognize it, but I also recognize that the Ministry of Energy has done significantly well in trying to communicate the developments of the sector and the government as well as the Barbados Renewable Energy Association. Sir, I want to just, because it is really non-contentious, but I really want to focus on something that is of a growing concern of mine over the years as far as renewable energy goes. We constantly hear about different technologies, battery storage, wave energy storage, solar, whatever it is. My greatest concern, not out of this procurement process, but out of any procurement process or engagement for renewable energies, is really waste stream management. And it is a great concern of mine. I know that in different jurisdictions, sir, there's an emphasis on establishing an arrangement in contracts so that the providers of the batteries, the providers of the solar panels, there's a take back after the useful life of those entities, of those items, so that they may ship it back to their jurisdictions, their countries, but they don't leave the waste there within the country that's utilizing it. And some may argue, which is correct, that this may lead to a higher price, a more costly intervention in terms of accessing renewable energy. For me, this is where the cost-benefit analysis comes off, and this is where the economic benefit versus the environmental benefit has to be considered. Is it the better approach for us to focus on the economic and the financial aspect of having cheaper electricity, cheaper energy, by way of keeping the batteries within our physical jurisdiction, or should we have a situation where we negotiate a take-back clause where the suppliers of these batteries, and I'm talking at utility scale, where they take it back to the countries and don't leave the waste in Barbados if we do not have a sector that can utilize the waste to be repurposed in a useful way in Barbados? This is just my opinion, sir, not the position of the government, but my greedy opinion. I would pay more money knowing that I can keep the environment clean for the future generation than pay less money today and leave the future generation to deal with the dump later on. And the waste streams that can be generated from renewable energy are significant, sir. And this is why the European Union moved 4 years ago to ensure that their efforts at negotiating utility scale provisions for different components in the renewable energy sector. Some of them may not have as significant a waste stream as others, but they all collectively have a significant one, particularly the solar industry, sir. So, sir, I want to commend the government. I want to commend the Minister as well of Energy. Since her appointment in the Ministry of Energy, I can tell you that there have been significant changes, and the mood and the enthusiasm that I felt from FTC all the way back to the Ministry of Energy is one of a commendable nature. I want to commend the government for presenting this amendment, and I want to give it my full support, and I would definitely look forward to seeing us add value to make this government more flexible with these amendments, sir. With those few words, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Harewood. Who's next? Her Honourable Senator Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to support the bill currently before the chamber, and to do so, having been the Minister of Energy under whose tenure Barbados' first national energy policy was developed, and in the context of a person who is formally trained in energy. It is interesting the way things evolve over time, sir. I remember when I decided that I was going to do a master's in energy law with a specialization in oil and gas and a subspecialization in renewable energy and environmental law for the energy sector, and then do a specialization in arbitration. And people, when I was saying to people, well, I'm doing this law master's in all the ranges of energy, people looked at me like, for what? What would you want to do that for? I mean, what would you do with it? That was the question. Those were the questions that people repeatedly asked me. And now it has become clear why you need specialist training in energy, because it is one of the largest and most rapidly evolving developmental planks all over the world, but particularly in small island developing states and developing economies where developed societies have built their development profile on fossil fuels and are now insisting, as we are because of the threat that they pose to our economic and social and environmental well-being, are now insisting that we should achieve the same levels of growth but not use fossil fuels, that we have to find renewable energy platforms. And it is critical in a context where Barbados has such high aspirations in terms of its renewable energy and the empowering of the average Barbadian by giving them access to renewable energy and revenue streams from renewable energy via the HOPE and other projects that are now the policy initiatives, the innovative policy initiatives of this administration. It is interesting that the climate in the international marketplace and the lack of access to the resources to enable this growth and to enable the achievement of our aspirations is in fact residing, as it always seems to, within the developed countries. So once again, they're monopolizing the resources and the means of achieving the goals. And while I make that point, sir, there is another point that I would want to make. And it has to do as well with the international climate and what I see as a deeply troubling national trend. There is now a substantial body of literature across universities and across the United Nations about the growing lack of trust in politicians and in public institutions and in the consequences for development and for governance at the national level. So with an erosion of public confidence, what you have is less and less buy-in from the public, and therefore poorer development outcomes and poorer connection with policy formulation, with policy implementation, and with cooperation on matters of policy to the extent that people are now prepared to vote against their own interests and to curse you for trying to help them because there are others standing on the bylines who have no national commitment, who with malfeasance, malefides, mischief, or massive ignorance are driving a public narrative that you are somehow attempting as a political class to cause the public harm. So over the course of the last few days and couple of weeks, we heard a national narrative. Oh Lord, you better be careful, you're causing the minister to have a lot to say, so look out, look at trouble coming now. Because somehow you would get the impression that if the matter is left for the discretion of the minister, or if the matter is left for the minister to act in his or her discretion after being advised, that somehow the minister is absolutely about to get it wrong or to mischievously act against the public interest. When our history in Barbados has been that while there have been things about which we can complain, and rightly so, and should continue to do so when we see things that are wrong, our history has been that by and large successive administrations in this country have gotten it right. We can disagree on a lot of things, but when you look at where we are positioned developmentally as a small island developing state without the resources, natural and financial, to which others had access, you have to stand up and applaud. But that is not now what is happening. What you get, sir, or what we have seen emerging, and I'm deeply concerned about it, because there are too many people out there who are gullible, innocent, or just believe that because they see something in print or hear it on a social media platform, that there is some truth on the back of it, on the basis of it. And because culturally we like to say, well, if it got smoke, it got to got some kind of fire. And the truth is, it may just be smoke. There may be no fire there at all. So to go, sir, to recent incidents that parallel what has happened relative to this matter of the distrust that we are now hearing being sown about the language of the amendment, with the minister having the discretion on advice to act in the public interest. A few weeks ago, we were told in relation, and this, what amazes me, sir, is that the people who are listened to do not have to have any particular technical expertise or knowledge. They don't have to have any training or understanding in the area. They don't even have to have the terms right. They can mispronounce them. They can trip over them. They can fail to understand what they mean. But people will stay saying, you hear so-and-so say so-and-so. There are all kinds of people now calling the stuff Dr. this and Dr. that are bare Dr. Boobies, sir. No qualifications, they're anything at all. And they are out there driving public opinion on everything from governance issues to COVID vaccines. And they have no training. But people are willing to listen to them. And you do not know what their motives are. Sometimes the motive is, sir, that they are now getting more attention than they've ever had in their whole life. More attention than they have gotten since their mother breastfed them as babies. And they love the public acclaim. And therefore they are willing to get out there and repeat things. And the more outrageous they are, the more attention and likes and hits and props and forwards and sends and retweets or reacts or whatever they say now, these people get. And we have to be wary of what is happening in a small society where larger and larger numbers are not listening to traditional media or formal sources of news or to informed, educated public servants who have no interest in misleading the public, but are choosing to be led by the ignorant or the mischievous. And some of these people are doing it, as I said, for personal attention, others for political or personal gain. They all have all kinds of strange motives that you don't necessarily know what the basis of those motives are. So now, sir, to a few examples, and if you're listening, you will see a trend emerging. During COVID, it was don't take the vaccine. You ain't gonna be able to have children. Look at all the people that took the vaccine that get pregnant since then. But these people still have legitimacy with the nonsense they're talking. The vaccine was going to cause all of us to become zombies, and black people were going to be particularly affected. All kinds of things were going to happen. You know, none of it has happened, but they have moved from COVID and gone on to the next topic, and other people have followed them. They then, sir, moved from COVID into national insurance. It was the scheme of breakdown. The politicians putting their hands on it, although the evidence was that only one political party in recent times had done in recent times, in the whole history of Barbados, ever put its hand, to use the Barbadian expression, in the national insurance monies, and didn't pay salaries, didn't pay national insurance, didn't pay back money that it took out of the scheme. In all of our years, only one administration for a very short period. But yet this thing about, you know, the scheme breaking down because the politicians got their hands in it. You know, you got to keep these politicians' hands out of the money because that's what happened to the NIS. So all you try to explain about demographics and population growth and the implications for that and the scheme, people were not listening because the narrative had already been driven by the naysayers. Well, when they get tired of that, they latch on to the child protection. The next thing you know, we were going to be marrying off children as soon as they got out of Pampers. Look sharp, we were about to give them injections that would turn the gender to other than the gender God gave them. And some very outrageous claims were being made, and people were standing up at platforms, open mouth, soaking it all in. They were going to the churches and trying to sell the churches this rubbish and so on. Well, it was Christmas and we gave them a Christmas gift. The change in the utilities and regulations. I said, Lord, hallelujah, before Christmas we got something to talk about. And then they started with that we have to be very, you know, you gotta be careful now because minister, you hear the minister? Somebody tell me the minister, and you got to be scared, you got to be frightened, sir, and so on, and so it went on, that the same group now had started another set of national confusion. Sir, we really have to be very careful about the implications of this for our economic growth, for our sense of social cohesion, for affecting policy coherence, for thwarting good and excellent outcomes of policy that are beneficial to the population as a whole, that threaten our positioning as a leader on this issue and in this sector and in this area, that are attempting to capsize our efforts to make sure that energy is used as an economic enfranchiser in Barbados in a way that poor people and ordinary people and middle-class Barbadians can have more capital in their hands than ever before, and ultimately will reduce our foreign exchange expenditure on energy. Now, I'm not saying there isn't going to be a cost in the transition. Let us remember that when the solar water heater industry was set up in Barbados, and I want to pay tribute to people like Dr. James Husbands, who was a pioneer in the field, and at the time, once again, a Barbados Labour Party government, as always leading, Tom Adams as Prime Minister, changed the marketplace. And as a result, Barbados always now comes within the top 5 countries in the world of having the highest penetration of solar water heaters per capita because of visionary policy and because people were willing to get behind it. And the government of the day did 2 things that this government ought to take example from. 1, they gave the concessions necessary to the investors and the business people. I see Senator Malulu smiling. As he should. As he should. And they gave, or is he always smiling? And they gave the concessions necessary to the consumer so that both ends of the market, the supply and demand end, got the appropriate regulatory, legal, and stimulation and incentives that allowed them to enter the marketplace and to remain in the marketplace and to benefit from the transition that was being effected. What we are attempting to do now is to position the country again ahead of the rest of the world. And we have to take the steps that are necessary. And what this legislation does is recognizes that in a rapidly evolving market, in a constantly changing atmosphere or landscape, that a government may need to be nimble, quick-footed, quick intervening to protect the public interest, to advance the public interest. And therefore, you can't have them come into Parliament for new legislation every time. You can't have them seeking permission every time. The technical experts have to be able to advise and say, Minister, there is an opportunity, move now. And that is all the legislation does. There is no ghost of wrongdoing past looming over this. There is no danger of wrongdoing future being created by any looseness in this legislation. It is merely a mechanism that allows a government in a rapidly changing market to be fleet-footed in the protection of the public and in the advancement of public interests. The government is not going to act on behalf of business or big business. That's not what the legislation says. The minister is not going to be acting on his own behalf. He will be acting on behalf of the public, and he will do so in an environment where all of the opposition in Barbados lines up to march every Saturday, or as many Saturdays in a month as they choose. They have megaphones and trucks and public systems. They talk in the air morning, noon, and night, or whenever they choose. They have access to the calling programs. Nobody has stopped calling programs, tried to cut them off. They are on all social media platforms, morning, noon, and night. They have TV broadcasts or live streams. They have audios. They have still photos. All kinds of mechanisms for free speech are available to the public in Barbados, and nothing in Barbados is quiet or silent or clandestine. Minister King made the point earlier that everybody in Barbados connected to everybody. So when you're trying to do things, the public hears. So there is no attempt or there isn't going to be any attempt to use this legislation for any kind of mischief. I want to remind you, I don't know how many of you saw the viral messages during COVID when the emergency legislation. The legislation enabling emergency directives were passed. Oh, social media went viral. I had people calling me, messaging me, frightened, because they had seen these messages in which they were told that the legislation was going to be used to empower the police, that the legislation was going to be used to take away people's houses, people's vehicles, all kinds of extreme things. And what I marvel at is that one by one, these lies and mischiefs and rumors and misstatements and false statements and false facts and false fictions and false frivolity come to nothing, and people still run along with it. I mean, it is an absolutely fascinating study in human behavior, that the same people who carry on with the same stories get caught out every time as being wrong, but they still come back again and have an audience. It is as if we are gluttons for this kind of, I don't know what it is. It has to be something in the who we are as a people and how we behave and so on. So I really am concerned about the way this is being cast, because there is no attempt to stymie, to silence the opposition. Everybody is free to talk, and therefore, if at all any minister attempted to step out of line using this legislation, there are bound to be extremely serious consequences for him, or in this case, as it may well be, for her. What we need to be more concerned about now, I think, is what are our chances of achieving our aspirations and the national goals which we have set ourselves, given the state of the international market, and insofar as we have 2030 as our line, our timeline. Is it a realistic and achievable objective given what is happening in the marketplace? The rapidly changing technologies, the fact that you cannot get access to battery storage, the fact that we are now at a point, if you hear what is emerging in the discussions in Dubai, where they are talking a lot about carbon capture and carbon storage and geoengineering. So the technology is changing, or the global international policy directives are moving rapidly, even as we speak. And those are my wider concerns. Those are my wider concerns, because it is critical for us to achieve our renewable energy targets in the context of climate change and what it means to Barbados society, economy, and various sectors of the economy and our environment as a small island developing state generally, and as a small island developing state specifically that is in the Caribbean, in what the World Bank has described as the second most disaster-prone area in the world. What does it mean for us if we are not able to achieve our renewable energy targets? What does it mean for us if we are spending $1 billion per year on fossil fuels, with the rising cost of fossil fuels, with what the posturing we are seeing now in Guyana and Venezuela, with the posturing or activity that we are seeing in certain oil sources, other parts of the world, Russia, Ukraine, and so on? What does it mean for us if we are fossil fuel dependent, with some of the highest fossil fuel prices in the world because of our distance from the centers of production and refinement, from extraction and production and refinement, and the implications then of the continuing cost of the rise in energy prices because of these conflicts in various theaters across the globe? What does it mean for us if we cannot take up that $1 billion and invest it, if that is a signal to stop speaking, I ignore it. that's all right, Linda. I'm almost there, sir. What does it mean for us if that $1 billion in fossil fuel expenditure cannot be diverted into supporting the poor and the indigent, into education and the education reimagination and the transformation of the educational sector on which we are about to embark, the new schools, making sure that every child has a bright future? What does it mean if we have $1 billion more to put into road repair or house building for the 17,000 people whose names are on a waiting list at NHC? But the people who are trying to detract from the government's efforts are not talking about how we are attempting to address these issues, and that if we can get the costs, the expenditures down, we can divert our foreign exchange and our national resources into things that benefit the average Bajan, into things that benefit people who live on Baxter's Road where I grew up, or people who live in Haynesville housing areas that I represented, and people who are middle class but live from paycheck to paycheck as most middle class do and need the opportunity for their children. What would it mean if we were able to achieve our renewable energy targets and didn't have the distraction of people telling the nation, oh, don't support it, the plan to be wicked, nefarious actions about to come afoot, watch yourself, the up to mischief? What would it mean? What would it mean if fossil fuel prices were not rising in the way that they are and driving inflation in this country? People complain every day about how expensive things are without considering that fuel costs. Whether you are driving, you bring something into the port, let's say some beef. It has come in from Argentina or from the US or wherever it has come from. It then has to go to some manufacturing plant to be made into a hamburger. It has to be driven there. So it was sailed here on a boat. Well, not sailed, because not wind sails, but it was brought here on a boat using fossil fuels. It will then be transported from the port to one destination using fossil fuels. At every sector of, if you take this piece of beef, at every stage, before it becomes your all-beef roti in Chefette, or your hamburger, that's a fact. That is it. People don't think about the value chain. At every sector, the costs are going on because of the expense of energy and fuel. And therefore, if we could address that, we can change the economic dynamic and the landscape in this country, if we could get to the bottom of that. But instead, you have people say, watch them, yeah, watch them. Be careful, I know what you're talking, and on and on and on. It really is deeply, deeply disturbing, sir. I want to close, sir, by making the point that I congratulate the government on attempting to use energy in a way that once again positions Barbados as a global leader. But more important, I want to congratulate the government for having the foresight to do what it takes to advance and protect the public interest in this country, and to do so even though there is malfeasance, mischief, malafides, and massive ignorance, and political mischief too. That's not M, but you know what I mean. Mankind making mischief, sir. To stop the government from achieving its strategic objectives, which are in the public interest. Press on, Minister, I believe this chamber is behind you.
Thank you, Her Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to take the opportunity as I close off today's debate, first of all, by attempting to, one, respond to a number of the questions that have been raised and to put some additional context where necessary on queries or points that have been made here in the Honourable Chamber. First, I thank Senator Malalu for his comments and his contribution, and I acknowledge his concerns, which have been well made. Senator Drakes, in her contribution, raised a number of queries that I'm going to attempt to respond to in a number of ways. First of all, on the question of the legislative framework that exists. First of all, there's a policy framework. I did speak in my initial comments on the legislation and on the energy sector overall about in the 2019 energy plan. I did speak about the updating of that plan in 2023 and the roadmap for that. Those are the policy guidance. That is the policy guidance that outlines the design of the sector. In particular, Mr. President, the IIRP. The IIRP, if you listen to the utility and those who function in the sector at a technical level, they use the IIRP, the Integrated Resource and Resilience Plan, as their roadmap for the technical design of the sector. What is more, there are a number of technical specifications. So while the legislation is in place, yes, there's also a grid code. The grid code is determined by the technical specifications, and it is followed by those either in the utility or as independent power producers. And you have the existing legislation which governs how all of those things work. But, Mr. President, there is, as we know right now, and we heard the website of the Ministry of Energy being referred to by a couple of speakers earlier today, and that website contains a piece of legislation in draft which is in the public domain, and so I can speak to it here. It is a piece of transformational legislation that we started working on during the course of last year. We put out in August of this year for public consultation. It has been the subject over the course of August this year up to the end of this year, up to today. It is on the website, the Electricity Supply Act, which will be the first comprehensive overhaul of the legislative regime governing the electricity sector. Contained within that legislation in draft, Mr. President, is a reference to microgrids and the ability to bypass even the existing utility and to have those new operators in the system. It is there for review and for inputs. We have shared it widely with the sector and all of the stakeholders. We have shared it with the public on the website. We created a portal to invite comments to come in, and we intend during the first quarter of the year to be able to go into a dedicated public consultation where, now that we have collated all of the inputs that have been received from the stakeholders through our Chief Legal Officer, we will then have 3 days of public consultation on the actual text itself in its consolidated form before going back to Cabinet, hopefully in the earlier part of the year, and then preparing that draft for laying it in Parliament. That is a public process which will capture much of what was asked about by Senator Drakes. In the in the Energy Transition Investment Plan, Mr. President, there was a commentary raised earlier about whether or not we are looking at all of the options. Fossil fuel phasing out, what are the various costs associated with different parts of the sector, Mr. President? We have simulated a range of scenarios, and we've stress tested them all. We've simulated a business as usual scenario. That's scenario one. The second scenario we have simulated is a net zero target for 2030. What will it take for us as a country, public and private, to reach the targets for 2030? But we've also, Mr. President, had a fail-safe. What will it take as an investment level for us to reach the same targets in 2035? So it is going to cost us a far more aggressive push, a higher level of investment if we are to meet the 2030 targets, we're going to have to be far more nimble to reach those 2030 targets, and as opposed to if we push them outwards to 2035, or if we were to continue with a fossil fuel-based sector as that business in the business as usual scenario. Those are all the things that we have already done, Mr. President, and are in the process of completing. And once that work is done and it is aligned with the energy mix and the roadmap of the IIRP, those things will go back to Cabinet for final approval. I want to say also on the question of stakeholder engagement, all of those documents have been subjected to stakeholder inputs. I have in my ministry detailed comments by BRIA, by all of the stakeholders on the draft of the IIRP. Ain't even final yet. Detailed line by line, section by section comments. Same thing on the Electricity Supply Act in draft. So I want to give you the assurance that not only are we attempting as a government to do the right things, but we're attempting to make sure we do the right things in the right way and bring all of our partners to the table to ensure we have a coherent outcome. We don't always agree. We don't always agree. We come from different perspectives. We have had, certainly I have had to immerse myself in every technical detail of the Ministry of Energy so that I understand the sector I am responsible for leading. And I am comfortable with the team that is working with me, who is also, right now, Mr. President, I was saying to one of my colleagues earlier this morning that I have right now in my ministry almost a skeleton staff. I do. My staff has worked throughout the year because there's all of this work that has brought us here today that we're still doing. And they have worked through vacations. Sometimes they're on vacation, they come back out, they do all kinds of things, and they're exhausted. And so I have half of my staff now at the end of the year saying, all right, we can take a break, and I have said leave them. Let them go off for a minute. Because come next year, we're at it again. Gone again. But this is a team that I have the privilege of leading. Mr. President, in the IRRP, for example, we talked about design issues again, and I want to point this out. In the IRRP of 2021, we had onshore wind. We have currently only less than, we have two at Ashford and one at Venture in St. John, 2 wind farms. Less than 1 megawatt each. One is already up and operating. The other one has just turned sod, but it's not yet there. We have just, and I'm sure you saw it in the newspaper, we worked every week for the last, I want to say 7 to 8 months steadily, meeting with our international partners to be able to get the long talked about Lambert's project at St. Lucie up and running. We have now erected, finally, 2 80-meter wind masts, one at Lambert's, one at Castle, and then there should be a third one coming up. The firm that has been working with us to erect those masts has come out to Spain. They were here just for the last few weeks. They erected those masts, and we are working through getting the very first comprehensive wind studies, not for less than 1 megawatt of wind energy, but in this instance, between 30 to 50 megawatts. That is now being rationalized for insertion into the IRRP. In 2021, Mr. President, we did not have hydrogen. Hydrogen is now included in the mix. Why? Because we have prepared, and we just have prepared to finalize the very first PPA and the very first project on hydrogen in Harrows and St. Philip. And you have heard the team from Renewable speaking about that project, and the HDF team. We also, as a ministry, meet with them every single week to make sure we're working through a range of issues. Now, Mr. President, the question about consumers and the price to consumers is an important one. And I want to situate my response first in this way. Our Prime Minister launched the Bridgetown Initiative, named after Barbados. We have a team of officials who worked on the crafting of the Bridgetown Initiative, pulled the concept together, shopped it around globally. And I'm sure that many of the people that Senator Thompson spoke about who are creating mass hysteria and all of the words that she does describe, if you ask them what is the Bridgetown Initiative, half of them can't tell you. And they care, she's right. But what's the Bridgetown Initiative, Mr. President? The Bridgetown Initiative presupposes that there has to be a balance between the right to development for countries like ours and the ability to access financial resources from development institutions, including those at the World Bank and so on, with whom we engage. Now, Mr. President, if we, and the Prime Minister has spoken about it as Minister of Finance, if we are always on the market talking about our ability to access capital for debt, and the debt is available, yes, but at predatory rates, predatory terms, the conditions are so onerous that it makes it impossible for countries to even be able to use it effectively, then we are back to square one, and our development trajectory is on a downward spiral as opposed to an upward one. And so, Mr. President, the same principles that have been promoted with regard to the Bridgetown Initiative are relevant here in energy. They're relevant here too, Mr. President, and why? If we develop a renewable energy sector that is able to inbuild benefits only to lenders or to investors, and in the long run results in a significant over time increase in electricity prices to the consumer, to the extent that we may have the most RE on the grid in the world, but the highest electricity prices in the world, then we have not done what we were meant to do either. That's not the policy of this government. Even if we expect that there's going to be an initial additional cost as a result of onboarding RE because of things like feed-in tariffs, or onboarding battery storage, as we have heard from the utility themselves, the expectation is that over time the prices will come down, because in anything there is always an initial capex investment that pushes the cost up, but it comes back down over amortization periods that are reasonably implemented and the terms that are reasonably implemented. That is what we as a government are also attempting to ensure, Mr. President, and so we intend to make certain that we have that balance between the public interest, consumer interest, and of course, creating an attractive environment for persons, both local and global, to come into the renewable energy space. Who owns the storage, Mr. President? That was a question. In all of our discussions with the sector, the understanding is that we expect two things to happen here. The grid code is managed by the utility. There's a requirement, even in the existing legislation and in the new legislation, which is out for draft and for comment, that the requirement is there for there to be a dispatch code. That is also required of the utility. In our discussions, there is no independent power producer, for example, at this stage, Mr. President, who has come forward for anything except a generation license. Don't mind what you see in the newspaper, the intention to apply for a license. They have flooded the newspapers in the last few weeks, principally because every IPP who has gone to the BLPC for a connection or for a power purchase arrangement has been told, if you want to get connected, you have to bring batteries. And so once we started to talk about what we were going to be doing, people started to get ahead of the queue or think they were getting ahead of the queue by publishing an intention to apply for a license. We don't have any applications for licenses in the Ministry of Energy. However, I can tell you that, not one for storage, not one. We have what I have described to you for generation, but not for storage. And so the intention is that once this framework is completed and the team is already working on ensuring that we have the storage license ready and we have the portal, the ELPA portal, which is already there for generation, is being upgraded to allow for storage licenses, we expect that there will begin to be the submission of applications for storage as well. That will mean that in the same way that the grid is buying generation from independent power producers, they're also doing the same thing for storage. So the owners of the storage will be the same way we have the owners of generation, independent power producers, and they will be independent storage producers. But the management of the generation, as will be the case with the management of the storage, would have to remain, it is our view, with the utility. It's the only practical thing to do. It's the only practical way to approach it. The utility and every independent power producer and all of the associations working with us have made it clear that the management of it must remain with the utility. So there's a dispatch code as well, which is incorporated. What we have also commenced looking at as a recommendation from one of the associations is the development of a dispatch policy. because there are concerns, and we want to make sure that we have incorporated them as to how the system will then be rolled out, and we want to make sure that that is in place to allow for a seamless transition. If I'm the utility and I'm managing the storage and the generation, am I pulling from you versus you? What guides my decision making? So there will be a policy framework around that, and we will have that put in place, Mr. President. Now, finally, Mr. President, the other question that was asked was on the, or rather the point that was raised was on the Fair Trading Commission. Mr. President, last week when I was away, when this honorable chamber met, I was in Portugal attending OECD Global Forum meetings. And in the same way, Mr. President, that CAIPO and the International Business Unit have had their roles evolve over time as a result of international developments, and you would know this just as well as I do. As a result of the requirements of the global community, the FTC, as these sectors have evolved, it is no different. The FTC, like CAIPO, like IBU, like many other entities, have assumed additional responsibilities over the years with no additional resources being provided to them, or equally over the years. When we had to add hydrogen, this hydrogen project at Harrows in St. Philip, Mr. President, the IDB and one consulting firm had to come in and do the technical work on the methodology for identifying a tariff rate for hydrogen. The FTC did not have the resources in-house. The same thing, Mr. President, for storage. They didn't have the resources in-house. And so we accept, and we have committed as a government, and certainly my ministry, we are committed to ensuring that the FTC is made fit for purpose, not just in a 2023 Barbados, but in a future forward Barbados in terms of utility regulation. And we expect that once the developmental work and the transformational work has been completed, that we will see a new look institution that is in a position to take us where we need to go. I believe it was Senator Nichols. He talked about 2 years to have a decision on a rate review. I don't know if anyone thinks that the same persons who will speak about how long things take to go through the court system, Mr. President, would not agree that 2 years for a rate hearing to go through a quasi-judicial body is a reasonable period of time. In that period of time, we have already talked about, Mr. President, where I started today, how fast this sector has moved. And we call it regulatory lag. In my meetings with the staff and with the industry over the last couple of weeks, I've used it as, you know, when a car has timing belt issues and it goes forward and all of a sudden it starts to cut out and then it drives it back a little bit and then it goes forward again and it drives it back a little bit. The regulatory lag in the renewable energy sector has been almost destructive in some instances, simply because as fast as the sector can go forward, the policy has gone ahead, but the regulations have to catch up. We have the FTC at this point, Mr. President, and Senator Nichols spoke about it in his contribution, with a decision on storage up to 10 megawatt, up to systems of 10 megawatts, below 10 megawatts, for 4 years. But Mr. President, we kind of way past there. Because if you are piloting up to 50 megawatts, but the IRRP since 2021 called for 206 megawatts of storage, there is regulatory lag. And it results in delays in implementation. And it's not because they have any malice of forethought, but simply because they need the resources. And we are committed as a government to provide those resources. And so I hope that I have taken the time and I have answered all of the questions that were raised by the colleagues. I'm just skimming quickly through my notes to make sure that I have. I believe that the lawyers in the Honourable Chamber have adequately covered the issues relating to the treatment in law in the legislation as it is drafted, the issues of precedent in legislation, the terms of definition as it relates to what constitutes a public interest, and how the legislation works within the context of broader legislation in the country, as well as the principles of natural justice and administrative justice and so on. And so I hope that I have been sufficiently detailed, sufficiently clear on a substantive matter. I regret that there are those that attempted to speak very quickly in press conferences very recently who clearly did not take advice. And if they had taken advice on a clearly technical matter, perhaps, they may have been able to contribute more substantively to the conversation at a national level and be seen, therefore, as a natural leader and successor to she who globally has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential women in the world. You don't get to be that well recognized using misinformation, half information, no information, and no technical advice. You have to come with substance. And that is what these subject matters, and I believe this is what Barbados in this moment requires of leaders, and particularly aspiring leaders. But with these few words today, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. All senators against please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Utilities Regulation Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Utilities Regulation Amendment Act 2023. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Meetings, the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation of a parcel of land situate at Dodds Plantation in the parish of St. Philip in this island, and more particularly described in the schedule for residential, commercial, and recreational purposes.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, this is certainly a far simpler resolution. This matter has been brought before the Honourable Chamber on more than one occasion in different locations around the country. I believe we are aware that the Minister of Housing has announced on more than one occasion that it is the government's ambition to build over 10,000 houses over a given period. And as a consequence, you have seen, and we certainly in this Honourable Chamber have come here more than once to approve either by compulsory acquisition or in some instances, as we're doing here today, to vest in the National Housing Corporation parcels of land for the purpose of housing accommodation and housing construction. In this particular instance, Mr. President, this is 48.43 acres of land being vested in the National Housing Corporation for residential, commercial, and recreational purposes. It is the area in St. Philip, which is relatively close to Dodds Prison. We know when we think Dodds, we think of Dodds Prison. I want to begin by saying that the Ministry of Housing and Lands, the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the relevant officials from Dodds Prison have conducted the necessary site visits to the area and have ensured that the area is fit for housing development and that there is no conflict between the area to the north, which is Dodds Prison, and the area on the other side of Highway 4B, which is meant for the purposes that I have just outlined. The principal use for this particular housing area, Mr. President, is for the persons who have been affected by the Rock Hall relocation program. And so these persons are expected to go into this area, as you would have heard in the other place when the Honourable Minister spoke about it. In addition to housing, Mr. President, this area will also have a green area, and they will have a green space. I think one of the things that you will hear, we heard certainly this last few days in the other place as they discuss planning and development planning in the country, and we will have an opportunity, I expect, to have those similar conversations very soon, that the importance of green spaces included in communities for recreational purposes, but just for mental health at times, Mr. President, is a part of the commitment of this government. And so I hope to belabor this particular resolution, Mr. President. And so with those very few words, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Any speakers on this matter? The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, the compulsory acquisition by the state of parcels of land situate at Work Hall in the parish of St. Philip in this island, and more particularly described in the schedules for the public purpose of regularizing a squatters' housing area.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This, again, is a fairly simple resolution. We have approximately 20.988 square meters of land, around 5.18 acres. And this particular area, Mr. President, constitutes 7 different parcels of land, 4 of which are vacant. The remaining pieces, three plots of land, Mr. President, have some structures on them, and there are persons who have, and I don't think that we as a government typically talk about squatters per se, we talk about unplanned settlements. I think that's what we call them, unplanned settlements. And so in this area, Mr. President, we are compulsorily acquiring this land in order to have housing development in the area for the persons that are there. And so there was a social survey conducted to assess what actually obtains in the area, what are the conditions of the area, and the findings and the recommendations coming from the Ministry of Housing and Lands were that you should acquire the lands, all 7 parcels of the land comprising 21.062.4 square meters, and that land would be used to regularize the housing arrangements for persons at Work Hall, St. Philip. And with these, again, very few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do not pass.
Any speakers? The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable Senator Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do not mean to detain this chamber, but I feel, Mr. President, obligated to say something in this matter, Mr. President. Mr. President, this government is making tremendous effort to regularize matters that arose because people encroached on people's property, occupied it, and were aided and abetted by those in charge. And it will cost the taxpayers of this country large sums of money to fix the problems of moving the people and to fix our water supplies in another area. And I really think that it is fine to have the political benefits of votes in the constituency, but it comes at tremendous cost. And while what may happen in St. Philip can be regularized by moving the persons, what will have to happen, sir, in the Bell, we will all pay for, because we will have to spend large sums of money as proposed on the billboard that is saw to protect the water table and put in the sewer system. But Mr. President, the problem of squatting, and I don't call it unplanned settlements at all, the problems of squatting in this country are real, and it probably speaks to the level of lack of respect for people's property, where people will encroach on property and the landowner who pays the taxes and are responsible for all that happens has to stand up and fight to retain your property. And I don't know if there's an easy solution, because it is not, you cannot take matters into your own hands when someone comes and puts a structure on your property. You have to seek your redress in the courts and employ lawyers at great cost, and sometimes you lose. And it is something that needs to be discouraged. I don't know if there's anyone who has the heart, any elected officials who stand in any chamber that has the heart to address it in the public, but it's something that needs to be discouraged, Mr. President. It is painful, Mr. President, when you see not wealthy people, poor people, lose property because someone squatted on it, or someone had an encroachment, occupied a large portion of it, and when the appropriate time has passed, they claim it. And it's a national problem, and it's happening more and more, Mr. President, and it needs to be discouraged. That's all I have to say, Mr. President. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. The question is that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is now passed. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that, having completed the business of the government for today's sitting of the Senate, that the Senate adjourn until Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m. Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m.
The question is that the Honourable the Senate will now adjourn until Wednesday, December 20th at 11 a.m. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate stands adjourned.